So this is the title, and at the end of a day devoted to apraxia, I won't start definitions of apraxia, but what I want to do with the two first slides is just to limit what I'm talking about and what I'm leaving out. So first of all, just believe me or believe me not that there are three motor actions, three domains of action that are affected in apraxia, and that these three are more or less independently have all their own problems. This is the use of tools and objects, of real tools and objects. These are communicative gestures on command, like emblems. These are gestures with a fixed meaning, or the pantomime of tool use, which is also a communicative gesture because it doesn't interact with the materially, with the surrounding, but it carries a message. It can be understood. If I do this, you can understand that I mean a hammer, so it's a communicative action. And the imitation of gestures, of meaningless gestures. And out of these three, I will talk only about the first two, for the simple reason that there is hardly any literature, there's very little known about rehabilitation and therapy of imitation of gesture, and also because it's doubtful whether this is really whether it makes sense to rehabilitate gesture imitation, whether it has any impact on daily living. The second introduction or delimitation is a clarification of what do we mean by generalization. What do I mean? And there are different aspects which can be examined. The first is a generalization can mean that one item is trained and that this generalizes to the same action done with other items. So, for instance, if in ADL therapy toothbrushing is trained, then the patient, if he's a male, will also be better in shaving. So it generalizes from one item to the other, but the same domain of action. The other, more tricky and more difficult to examine and to handle generalization is from the therapeutic setting to the context of daily living. This, as we will hear, is a problem, for instance, for communicative gestures, which may be quite good or may be trained on command, but there is a relative difficulty to transfer this into the spontaneous use of gestures outside of the therapy. And the third one is the possibility that there is something like a general improvement of apraxia, and that there's consequently a generalization from one domain of action to the other. So, for instance, from imitation to tool use, or from communicative gestures to tool use. I left it out because, again, there are, I think, very little reliable data. The study of Smania claims that they have reached that. I must say I'm rather skeptical about this. Okay. So it's also. Yeah, and so I'll talk first about tool use and then about communicative gestures. And for tool use, just to give you a feeling, I'll start with this observation of a patient who has a right-sided hemiplegia, a severe aphasia, and is confronted with this device, and there is a threat, and I'm giving him a Can you hear it? Well, it's German anyway. So I ask him, what can you do with that? What can you do with that? So you see he has the scissors, but this is a screw. I don't know how to call it, the mother of the screw, we say in German, the mother. So what could you do with this one? So how do you do? Can you cut off a piece? He says, well, yes and no. And you see how he holds it? This is not the grip of a scissor. This is just a not defined grip. And that's what I mean. So the selection of the grip of the manipulation depends on the purpose, on what the scissors are doing. It's one mechanical chain that's going from the hand, from the shoulder to the object. But this is not what we're talking about. Now, you could criticize that this is a very artificial situation, and that perhaps there are less problems in a more natural situation. But indeed, these patients, the patients with left brain damage, with severe left brain damage, if they are apraxic, they also have, or some of them have apraxia really in daily living, in basal ADL, like putting on a pullover, brushing the teeth, spreading butter on a slice of bread. And Pascal already talked about our ADL test. It was the publication with Sonja Hagmann, where she's an occupational therapist, just observe the patient putting on a pullover, brushing the teeth, and spreading butter. Just give the patient all he needed, but then no further help. And she recorded both repairable error when the patient could still proceed, and a fatal error when the patient did not reach the goal of the action. And this is what we will be concerned with, not with the. So this fatal error is equivalent to the judgment whether the patient is independent in this particular action or activity or not. And we examined 35 patients with a first unilateral stroke, and all had right-sided hemiplegia and all had aphasia. So these additional difficulties for ADL were the same in all patients. But nonetheless, there was a large variety. On the one hand, there were, which is, I think, important, in spite of aphasia, in spite of hemiplegia, and although they had no previous therapy, there were about half of the patients, 17, who could complete all three or at least two of the actions. But there were another half of the patients who were either completely dependent on help and dependent on help of 2 out of 3. And this score correlated with the scores on conventional apraxia examination, although, anyway, it's a bit difficult to interpret because interpretations are always weak data in cerebral lesion patient, because brain lesion does many things, and the bigger the lesion, the more impairment. But anyway, we can say that these patients have a problem beyond aphasia and beyond problem with tool use, beyond aphasia and beyond hemiplegia, and this is apraxia. This has been the first meaning of the word apraxia 150 years ago. Now, out of these 35 patients, we took 15 who were dependent on help in all 3 or in 2 of these activities into a therapies study, which has already been mentioned. And the schedule of this study was that patients received, I'll go here. Yeah, this is just this slide shows you just the intensity and the amount of therapy they had. If after, I'll go here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For some reason, it does not go on. Can anybody help me? Oh, that does not sound so good. Sorry. Oh. So in weekly intervals, all 3 activities were tested by the occupational therapist. And each week, only one of them was trained, where, in the morning routine and in the afternoon in a therapy session, whereas for the other, the patient received maximal support, but no advices. And we could, with this you can calculate, and we could calculate for each week the changes for each activity, and we could collapse across the whole study the changes in the activities with training, the T, and those without training. And remarkable and importantly, this was simultaneous. So at the same time when one activity was trained, the other 2 were non-trained. So we could directly compare the course without therapy with the course with therapy. And the result was very clear-cut. It was that only in weeks with therapy there was improvement. Improvement here means that elimination of a fatal error, that is, that the patient gains independence in an activity where he was dependent before. All these cases virtually were in the weeks with therapy. So this means 3 things. The first thing is that therapy is efficacious because it improves. And if you calculate it, that means that in about 2 rounds of therapy, there was an elimination of a fatal error, there was independence. But it also means that there's no spontaneous improvement, because in the weeks without therapy, the improvements equaled with the deterioration, so there was no net improvement. And it means, third, and this is the important thing, that there's no generalization, because the non-trained activities are simultaneous with the trained. So if there's a generalization from one item to the other, they should have an improvement also without training. They had not. Yeah, this is just this was effective, but success was restricted to the trained activity. Now, one question to ask then is, does this depend on the selection of the therapeutic approach that we have no generalization? And we distinguished 2 principal therapeutic approaches, or I will propose you 2 principles, which is something which has already been today in the morning when there was talking about procedural and explicit learning. It's all about the same concept, the same basic concept in different versions. So this version I propose here distinguishes between bottom-up and top-down approach, meaning that bottom-up is more or less a training, a narrow training routine of the routine of doing one task. So in this, it's unimodal, it's predominantly really the motor act of doing it, no verbal, not much verbal about, not much instruction. And that's here where we also probe the errorless learning in the first study, but combined with the top-down approach, and then with guided errors, so that really the patient is guided through the full activity. And this is practiced and repeated. The top-down approach is, if you want, more ambitious. It aims at making the patient understand what his problems are, and being able to cope with them himself. And it's based on a more multimodal approach with verbal, written, drawing instructions and help, with explicit feedback and explanation of errors and explanation, so that the patient can learn what he should do better. And also in this sense, not errorless, and but letting the patient make errors, so can he learn from the errors, and encourage him to find solution himself. Now, intuitively, I think one would say, well, the first one, the bottom up, this will not generalize. If you train only one activity, why, yeah, it's less. By contrast with the top down, one would rather be expecting a generalization, because there should be insight and problem-solving capabilities trained, and this is by definition problem-solving generalizes, because it's for novel things. And so we made a second study, this time only with 6 patients, 6 chronic patients, which are still apraxic. And in this study, we explicitly confronted, I'll show you the design in a moment, 2 approaches, one based on this direct, on this bottom-up, and the other one, which we called exploration training, on the top-down. And this, so it's more or less what I already told you in the last slide. In the direct training, it's really doing the task again and again, and learn and being guided through the task. Also training of single steps, but nothing outside the task. By contrast, in the exploration training, we tried, or Maike Daumüller, who was, and Sonja Hagmann, the occupational therapist who did it, tried to get the patient understand the functional significance of structural details of mechanical relationships, and get a deeper understanding of the object used. But these objects were explored, but the task itself was not performed. It was really learning about the task. And again, yeah, this is the classification, and the expectation was that it is the exploration training that both should lead to a amelioration, but that the exploration training should rather transfer or generalize to non-trained activities. And now, very shortly, the design, which is the same principle as the first study, namely that there are, in this case, not just 2, but 2 groups of 2 activities each, and these were complex activities of daily living, which involved also technical equipment like a coffee cooker, or like at that time it still existed, the tape recorder, and again it was in regular intervals every 2 weeks. All these 4 activities, which were divided into 2 groups of 2, were tested, and then there were 2 intervals where nothing else happened, where they were only repeatedly tested to get something like a baseline, a stable baseline. And then the first of these groups was subjected to therapy, and for 2 intervals of 3 weeks was each interval, no, 2 weeks. And then, but in the first interval, it was this exploration training, and then it was direct training. And then the order was reversed. And the other 2 activities were trained, first with exploration, then with direct training. And then again, as in the previous study, you can collapse across the whole therapies about all patients, or you can for each patient collapse the results, say in the intervals with direct training, in the intervals with exploration training, etc. And yeah, and then you can for each of these intervals assess whether there is a change in the number of errors from the start to the end of the interval. And this is here shown for the 6 patients. And there are several interesting things. So first of all, if it goes down, it's getting better, because this is the number of errors, and this is the change of the number of errors. So if it's negative, it's an improvement. And first of all, you see that simply repeating the examination already had an effect. There's a significant a significant amelioration, reduction of errors. But that, yeah, there is no, let's start with the two therapeutic approaches. There was a significant and very conspicuous improvement with the direct training, but with the exploration training, this did not generalize for the simple reason it did not improve at all. So the patients with the exploration training did not benefit. They were not better after it than before. And as you see, there was no simultaneous improvement, neither with exploration training, of course, because this did not work itself, but also not for direct training. And one point to mention is that in the end, we repeated the test with slightly different equipment, another type of coffee cooker, and there was a slight augmentation of the number of errors. And also in a follow-up, after I think 3 months, there was some deterioration, so not to the initial level. This is just the changes. So that, yeah. Now, how am I with the time? How many videos can I show? Okay. Yeah? Okay. How many videos can? Pardon?
15 minutes.
I do? Okay. So this is just an example of a patient who has successfully trained making coffee in the study. And now this is the control, this is a variant, and there something happens which is some of these problems which you need generalization of problem-solving capacities in daily living, or you are lost. And in this case, it's that the plug, you see here the plug, is behind the coffee maker. And this is the socket. Now the patient looks for the plug. This is Maike Daumüller, the occupational therapist. He looks for the plug, he doesn't find it because it's behind. He tries to put on the machine, so he's not just, he's attentive and he tries, he trains to do it. And then, yeah, now he finds a plug. It's rather slow, so there's, yeah, he has found a plug. You see, it's a patient with a hemiplegia, with a severe aphasia, and he's, I think, 3 or 5 years after the accident. So it's really very chronic. And I should say, for knowing plugs, he is a technician, a former professor of the Technical University, so he knows what electric currents are and what plugs are good for. So now you see, he has found a plug. But this plug is on a water cooker. Yeah, can you follow? He's searching, he knows from the training, that's my interpretation, from the therapy, because he has had therapy with coffee cooking, that he needs a plug, and that at this part of the routine, the plug has to be inserted in the socket. And now he has a plug, but it's certainly not functional, because it's not. And you see, he's quite skillful. This problem he solves quite skillful to insert the plug into the socket. But still it doesn't work. And now, by chance, he sees the real plug and he recognizes it. He's not lost all. Yeah, you know so much of German? He said, Scheiße Mensch. which is the only thing he can do. He can say he's a severe global aphasics. Okay. Now he's putting it on. So you see, there is no, that's the problem with, there was no generalization to other items, not in the therapy itself, and as this anecdote shows, outside the therapy, even with the same activities, when there is some really minor change in the arrangement. Okay, so let's go to communicative gestures, and I don't want to elaborate this here, but believe me or believe me not, pantomime of tool use is a communicative gesture, and here you have two patients with left brain damage and aphasia being asked to show how you iron. Can you show me how to iron with a flat iron? Yes, I have it in the hand. And I think it's interesting. It's not that she doesn't know how. One would say, I would say, it's not that she doesn't know how to iron. It's that she doesn't know how to show the iron. Yeah, because it's evident that she does the right movement, but she does not keep the distance from the table for showing that there's an iron between her hand and the table. Another patient, how to so again he's searching for this, yeah? It's really how to show it. Which are the features that must be shown to make it recognizable. And the distance between the hand and the table or the flat is necessary to recognize that it's an iron and not, say, a razor. Okay. Again, the question: how much time? Now, I think I'll make a jump. Doesn't work, so I have to do it anyway. Yeah, then very shortly, if the machine doesn't let me make a jump, so I don't jump. We had another. So we have demonstrated that the pantomime is just one index of general the ability to make meaningful gestures, understandable, comprehensible gestures. In this study, where patients with aphasia were shown video clips and were asked to retell them. Retelling means to re-gesture them, because they were all extremely reduced in their verbal output, and there was you see there's really a very tight correlation between this pantomime score and the ability to make a understandable retelling of a story. So this is also apraxia, and this is a somewhat neglected aspect of apraxia, because it's more discussed in the aphasia community than in the apraxia community, is that one of the impacts that apraxia has on daily living of the patients is the impairment of the ability to communicate with the hand, to use gestures for compensating lacking verbal output. And here too we thought that this is worthwhile a therapy trial, and this was with Michael Daumüller, a trial of gestural communication. And there were 23 severely aphasic patients. Not all were apraxic, but most of them were apraxic also for pantomime. But actually the criterion for taking them into the group was that they had very severe aphasia and reduced verbal output. And what they were trained on producing communicative, recognizable gestures, some relating to objects, some without direct reference to objects, and not necessarily pantomimes, but all kind of gestures were allowed or were elaborated in the study, in the training, with the goal to make them recognizable. And the design was in principle the same as in the previous study. Again, the gestures were divided into 3 groups, and after each interval of 2 weeks, all gestures were probed, and there was also always within the interval, one of the 3 groups of gestures was trained and the other not, and then you could we could calculate how the score on these gestures improved during intervals with training and intervals without training. Is this? And in this study, we did not really we did not use different techniques of rehabilitation, but in the rehabilitation, in the therapy, there were 2 main goals which, I won't classify them now because the classification will change when we, or we'll have a new aspect when we see the results. Anyway, one of the goals of the therapy was to habituate the patients to gesturing. You should not, for the training of gesturing or for the employment of gestures for compensation of aphasia, one problem is that the patients, before they were aphasic, they were normal speakers. And as normal speakers, they have a lifelong habit of using gestures, but most of them accompany speech and evaluate and elaborate their meaning only in combination with speech. So the patient has to learn and has to accept that gestures can be used without speech, but then replace speech, but have then to be different than the gestures which simply accompany speech. You don't, if you just see my gestures, you don't see what I'm talking about. And the second goal, or the second content of the training, was that these gestures are recognizable. That means that they contain the decisive features of the object or of the action they are referring to, and that they combine them to a recognizable gesture. And to give you an idea of how it's like, this is was made in one of this. There were single sessions and group sessions for this therapy, and this is one group session. And the task is to show this is a hammer, and to tell you something about the patients. This one and this one are severely apraxic patients. This is an aphasic patient who was in the group but who is not apraxic. This is the occupational therapist. And you see, he has something of a hammer. There is a repetitive movement, but certainly it lacks the crucial features of a real hammer, that is that this repetitive movement goes in direction to a wall or to a table or to some flat, or to some object, and that it is that it stops abruptly, so that it and this is certainly not recognizable. now he is already trained and he knows he has already, this patient has been in the group before, and he knows that one strategy, if we don't find the real gesture, is just to look again at the, see what he's trying. There must be something else, he thinks. So he knows the strategy to just take the hammer and look at the hammer and then learn, repeat. And this aphasic patient is rather a pain in the neck. I don't know why they took him. And now you see how he's slowly approaching this, the correct. And now she's guiding him and emphasizing the acceleration. And now you see so you can't see if I'm pointing here. You see, yeah, so she's working also with imitation. She's working with all means. If you want, there's no restriction to the means, but there is a restriction or a goal that should be reached. You see, now it's still, that is hammering with the hand. She says, memorize, beware in your mind how you kept it, how you hold it, and now he has it. Good. So this just gives you an overview, and we are soon done. Now there were the 3 intervals, and in the first interval, the first set of items were trained. In the second set, in the third. And this rotated, but there was always a first, a second, and a third. And now this graph shows you the improvement. And it's first result is a very clear one. The red are the items that have been trained in the first interval, and you see there's a massive improvement for the trained items, but much less for the non-trained item. I'll come back to that. In the second week, there is this group of items that has been not trained in the first is now trained in again. It has a massive amelioration, much more than the third, which has not yet been trained, and when the third is trained, it ameliorates too. But as you see, there is also some improvement for the non-trained. So apparently there is some generalization from one item to the other. Well, one rather trivial explanation, or not so trivial, but would be that it's simply repeated testing that makes them better. That's we have seen in the last study on the complex ADL, that simply repeating the testing is also therapy. So we did a complementary study where another group of 10 aphasic patients, we simply assessed the gestures 3 times with weekly intervals, and to show how this improves. And indeed, there is some improvement, but it's less than the improvement of the untrained objects during the proper therapy study. So it seems there is indeed some improvement, some generalization from the trained to the non-trained objects. Though it's still the trained which are massively more improved, which improve much more. Now, looking back to our therapy goals, I think it's speculation, but we could speculate how this partial improvement, this limited generalization, is related to the different therapeutic approaches. The one was to familiarize patients with the use of gestures, to teach them that you can use gestures independently of speech. And if the patients acquire this knowledge or this habit of using gestures, then this applies per definition to any gesture, not only to the trained. It's just the principle. By contrast, to make the gesture correct, to make so like so, well, this is apraxia, that they can't do it. And this is apparently something which you can ameliorate for a single item, but which does not generalize. The apraxia remains apraxia. And there is another point, which we did not formally and systematically assess, but which is my experience when we talked about these patients, when in the patient conferences we talked about them, and the other therapists were asked, now, does he use gestures? And the result was very frequently no. So that this is, as we heard, one of the limits of procedural, of this bottom-up learning, is that it is strictly or strongly related to the context. And so patients, at least some patients, learned it in the context, took the habit in the context of therapy, but did not transfer it to other therapies or to their familiar or to their surrounding, to their familiar context. So if you call this then bottom up or top down, it's just a matter of the name, but it's in a way in between. Now, to make the conclusion, although there is some generalization, I think the safe way is to to avoid the necessity of generalization or to reduce it, and that means very simple that therapy should be tailored to the permanent needs and desires of the patients and their relatives, and be tied so as closely as possible to the habitual environment of the patient's daily life. By the way, particularly for the communicative training, but also for the ADL, it's important to speak also and to enter the relatives into the set, because they decide, or they could ask the patient and encourage the patient to use gestures if he can't express himself by speech, and they are responsible whether they can help him to do the activities of daily living or leave him some independence. Okay, so otherwise, if it runs the danger of remaining a pure exercise of therapeutic efficiency, which does not help the patient to master the challenges of daily living. Okay, so I thank you for your attention. Merci beaucoup.